For the next couple of weeks, we will be talking about climate change and its implications for national security. Primarily, but not exclusively, the national security of the United States. So what's national security? For some of you, this is perhaps the whole reason you're an international studies major. National security is one of the enduring foci of international relations scholarship. Properly understood, national security is a blend of two paradigms, or frameworks for thinking about security: state security and human security. We'll discuss both briefly. Under the state security paradigm, the who or what to be secured is the state, or the set of quasi-permanent institutions like the military, the courts, and the bureaucracy, led by the government. The goal here is the maintenance of sovereignty, both internal and external. Internal sovereignty refers to the relationship between the state and the society, and the actual control by the state over its subjects and its territory. External sovereignty refers to autonomy from and legal and informal recognition by other states or external actors, unless that autonomy is ceded in part through legitimate domestic political processes. For example, the member states of the European Union are still sovereign, even though they have ceded some policy-making autonomy, especially on matters of economic and monetary policy, to the European Union. For example, during the Civil War, the United States was for the most part externally sovereign, but its internal sovereignty was challenged by the Confederacy. During the colonial period, the American colonies were mostly internally sovereign. The colonies were free to manage their domestic affairs and policies, but not externally sovereign. They had no standing vis-a-vis other governments other than through their representation by the Crown. That's what both the U.S. Civil War and American revolutions were about: the maintenance and creation of sovereignty. Now yes, of course, the Civil War was about slavery, but even more fundamentally, it was about who had the sovereign authority to allow or disallow the practice of slavery. The primary focus of state security is physical threats to that security, and thus state security is preoccupied with violent challenges, both foreign, i.e. other states or transnational actors like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and domestic, that is, armed rebellions, protest movements, and extremist groups using terror tactics. Under this paradigm, the main instruments of policy, or the agencies and actors tasked with ensuring security, are the military and the intelligence services. By intelligence services, we mean those agencies, like the National Security Administration or the Central Intelligence Agency, that are tasked with identifying, tracking, and countering or neutralizing potential threats, often covertly. Now, even under the most narrow conception of state security, other parts of government are often involved. For example, the U.S. Department of Energy and its semi-autonomous National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, oversee the research, development, and testing and acquisition programs that produce, maintain, and sustain the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But in the main, the state security paradigm is 1. Focused on the security of the state and the maintenance of sovereignty, 2. Oriented primarily around physical threats and the capacity to project force to deter those threats, and 3. Reliant on the military and intelligence services as the primary policy actors. Now, if this definition of security sounds a bit too state-centric and reductive in terms of what constitutes a threat for your tastes, you're not alone. First, some of the darkest moments in the 20th century, including Stalin's purges, the Great Leap Forward in China, and the Holocaust, were perpetrated in the name of state security, with the citizens of those states being labeled as traitors and enemies of the state. The North Korean state is more secure than most Western pundits would like to give it credit for being. But state security certainly has come at the expense of rank-and-file North Korean citizens, millions of whom starved in the 1990s in large part because the North Korean regime would not accept significant international assistance during a drought and famine. And second, our current moment makes crystal clear the fact that in facing some of our gravest threats, from pandemic disease to climate change, the military and intelligence services are not our first or last line of defense. COVID is a threat to humanity writ large. It's unclear what SEAL Team 6 or the Fifth Fleet can do to address this fundamental threat. For this reason, the human security paradigm became ascendant in the 1990s. The end of the Cold War created space for thinking about environmental security. It also created space as well for thinking about a variety of other problems, ranging from pandemic disease to poverty and hunger, that threaten human populations first and foremost, and affect national security in indirect but important ways. For instance, did you know that almost 4 times as many people died of malaria last year than in all armed conflicts combined? Or that annually, almost 800,000 people around the world die due to hunger and malnourishment? Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech in June of 1941 articulated the concept of human security rather well in proposing 4 fundamental freedoms everyone in the world should enjoy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Instead of positing the state as the entity to be secured, the entity to be secured is humanity, be it instantiated in a single individual, a household, or a community. The goal of human security is not the maintenance of sovereignty or protection against physical threat per se, but rather securing prospects for human development, the process of enlarging people's freedoms and opportunities and improving their life well-being. Human well-being is incredibly multifaceted, but at its base includes concepts like access to nutrition and healthcare, access to clean water and sanitation, access to education, and freedom from physical threats, and not just from enemies of the state, but from the state itself. The concept of national security blends together these two paradigms. It is about securing the nation, which is the responsibility of the state, but the nation itself is the populace and the economy, which are engines that allow the state to pursue any other aims. They have a symbiotic relationship for all intents and purposes. Climate change threatens security, both human and state security, through a dizzying array of channels. Climate change will affect access to water, food, and energy, each of which is linked to conflict risk and national security and human security interests through different channels, as well as patterns and prevalence of infectious disease, the frequency and scale of humanitarian crises, and human migration patterns. In turn, climate change will stress existing institutions for managing transboundary resources, like rivers and fisheries, and may directly affect conflict risk between states. Climate change will also directly affect economies across the spectrum of levels of development, sunsetting some sectors of the economies while creating new ones. We're already seeing how deindustrialization and the loss of secure blue-collar jobs are affecting U.S. domestic politics. We can expect a lot of that kind of dislocation moving forward. And the situation is more complicated still. The second-order effects of attempts to mitigate climate change will have seismic effects for global energy systems. These effects will have particularly important security implications for major legacy hydrocarbon producers and countries that invested heavily in energy exploration and infrastructure during the 21st century commodity boom, which was roughly from 2002 to 2014. They will also affect countries with large exportable endowments of transition metals, like aluminum, copper, rare earths, lithium, and cobalt, that will underpin transitions to more sustainable energy systems. These risks are both numerous and poorly understood for at least four interrelated reasons. First, there's still some fundamental uncertainty about the relative conflict risk associated with climate change. Climate conflict links may operate through a variety of channels, some of which we have already kind of hinted at earlier, but only some of which have been really subjected to rigorous analysis. A recent expert elicitation exercise, which is basically a fancy way of identifying the consensus position of a panel of experts, asked conflict scholars to place climate variability and/or change in context with other well-established risk factors for domestic armed conflict. This exercise concluded climate variability and/or change was a less important source of conflict risk than other well-documented conflict drivers, like low socioeconomic development, low state capacity, and intergroup inequalities. And that the scientific literature on the subject was characterized by the highest degree of uncertainty. However, the most common characterization of climate conflict risk in policy discussions is as a threat multiplier. That is, it exacerbates existing drivers of conflict like poverty, low state capacity, intergroup inequalities, and economic shocks. This language is very prominent in U.S. national security circles, as we'll see next week. That is, climate change may exert direct effects on conflict, but likely exerts even larger indirect effects operating through other known drivers. Second, climate change does not fit very neatly into conventional security paradigms for risk mitigation or neutralization. Other emergent threats, like say the cyber domain or autonomous weapon systems, complicate conventional practices of deterrence and compellence, but do not necessarily obviate traditional approaches policymakers can bring to the table for trying to lessen risk. Those other tools, that cyber and drones, are typically wielded by state or non-state actors that can be influenced by traditional measures intended to affect the risk-reward calculation of potential enemies. For example, cyber complicates attribution of attacks for sure, but ultimately the attackers can be identified and punished or deterred from future aggression. But you can't deter a flood or a drought. You might deter actors emboldened by these climate-related events, like Boko Haram, for example.
Lake Chad are caught in a conflict trap. Violent conflict between state security forces and armed opposition groups have blighted the lives of local communities and forced 2.5 million people from their homes. Climate change is compounding these challenges. Contrary to popular beliefs, the latest research shows that Lake Chad is currently not shrinking. After the chronic droughts of the 70s and 80s, the lake is in a period of expansion. But even though the lake is not shrinking, climate change is a serious problem for the region. The population is highly affected by seasonal and interannual rainfall variability. People don't know when the rains will come, how much rain will come, or where the water of the lake will be available. The uncertainty and the interaction of climate and conflict undermine people's day-to-day lives and their jobs, reducing their ability to adapt to climate change. Where once they might have moved to a different location to farm or graze their animals when the rains failed, military restrictions mean that these options may no longer be available to them. This is decreasing their ability to cope with both climate change and the conflict around them. One important step to break this conflict trap is to support resilient livelihoods. For the young, growing population living around the lake, where unemployment and underemployment are endemic, the lack of jobs and money is a major strain on resilience, and indeed one of the reasons cited for people choosing to join armed opposition groups, such as Boko Haram. Resilient jobs can be achieved, for example, through new climate-resilient farming approaches to diversify rural income. Climate and conflict-sensitive livelihoods can provide young men and women with employment opportunities in the face of a changing climate. With over 10.7 million people in urgent humanitarian need, Lake Chad's conflict trap can seem insurmountable. But the lake has always been a source of resilience, and it can be again. But even if the terrorist threat is surmounted, the climate is still changing. The impacts of climate change have to be tackled as part of peace-building efforts in the region if it is to break free of the conflict trap. In doing this, Lake Chad can once again become an engine for sustainable livelihoods and stability. And there is hope for sustainable peace in the region.
But those events themselves, the underlying drivers, the droughts, the lack of livelihood security, are going to still have direct effects for human security and may necessitate militarized response. And they can also generate public bads, like rapid unforeseen migration, or disease outbreaks, or government paralysis, that are independent of the conventional threats posed by non-state armed groups. Third, the pace and scale of the problem is not a good fit for existing approaches to security. We, and by we I mean humanity, are not very good at addressing slow onset calamities, or those that don't arrive as an obvious, clear and present danger. The biggest threats posed by climate change and disease have not materialized, at least not yet, as rapid onset transfixing events like Pearl Harbor. One day after the Pearl Harbor attack, which killed roughly 2,300 U.S. service persons and 68 civilians, and which occurred before Hawaii had even achieved statehood, the United States issued a formal declaration of war against Japan, the responsible party. The entire U.S. defense community, as well as the U.S. economy and the home front, including the shape and composition of the U.S. labor force, was reformed in a matter of months and years. By 1944, the size of the U.S. economy had almost doubled, growing a staggering 84% in just 4 years. Both my grandfathers served in the U.S. military during that time, one as a bomber pilot and the other as a nuclear scientist, working on uranium enrichment. Heck, my grandmother had a radio show where she would give tips to homemakers about how they could grow and manage and harvest and can the harvests of their victory gardens to help conserve resources for the war effort. The United States would end that war a radically changed place, with a permanent military-industrial complex, a vast standing military and intelligence community, and the main underwriter of institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and later the World Bank. It was an exceptional time that required, and more importantly, elicited, an exceptional response. Similarly, earlier in our lifetimes, the United States has reshaped many aspects of life in response to the galvanizing 9/11 attacks, which resulted in 2 foreign wars, a broad global anti-terrorism campaign, and a global reshaping of travel infrastructure and the travel experience. But like other slow onset problems ranging from the obesity epidemic to the chronic underfunding of Social Security, the danger is not really in death by a decisive blow, but rather through myriad smaller impacts that challenge the social and economic fabric of the country. Climate change is not really the wolf at the door, threatening to blow the house down. Rather, it's thousands of termites eating away at the frame, slowly, bit by bit, day after day, in unforeseen ways. But if left unattended, both are going to cause the roof to cave in. Finally, the effects of climate change on conflict may be large in the aggregate, but almost never are they the decisive causal factor, which stymies the development of mental models to guide policymakers in crafting responses. Arguing any particular conflict was caused by climate change is exceedingly difficult. Multiple motivations are almost always present among conflict participants, and these motivations are both stated and unstated. Also, contextual factors, like dependence on agriculture for livelihoods, patterns of exclusionary ethnic rule, and low levels of economic development affect whether a given climate shock, right, in the form of a drought or a flood, is going to result in violence. Most of the research on climatic conditions and conflict finds climate shocks raise the probability of a large-scale event, like, say, armed conflict onset or the outbreak of a war, occurring relative to some baseline level of risk, or increases in the frequency with which smaller-scale events, like a protest, or individual battles or skirmishes, or a cattle raid, occur. That is, climate shocks are probabilistically causal in the sense that they make something more or less likely. They are not deterministically causal in the sense that they are wholly responsible for the outcome. These probabilistic relationships emerge from the study of hundreds, if not thousands, or tens and hundreds of thousands, of cases using quantitative methods, including meta-analyses, so combining the results of 50 or 60 different studies together. That is, the evidence is stronger in the aggregate than it is in any particular case. Let me reason by example for a second. Does smoking make lung cancer more likely? Of course. This relationship has been confirmed over and over and over and over. We even understand the biology behind it now. My maternal grandfather died of lung cancer. He smoked until the age of 21. So was my grandfather's lung cancer caused by smoking? Well, probably not, or at least not mostly. After World War II, he worked in a lumber treatment facility where he was exposed to inhaling toxic chemicals for most of his adult life. That is, other factors were probably more important in explaining the outcome, even if the quote-unquote causal factor was present and may have been a contributing factor, in this case the causal factor being smoking. Climate change and the COVID pandemic are highlighting key weaknesses in U.S. national security strategy and policy. Addressing these issues will not just require making traditional security agencies more climate and pandemic aware, but a reimagining of the concept of national security itself. This is going to mean everything from changing the focus of troop deployments, to altering the missions of forward and domestic bases, to refocusing military research and development spending, and refining officer education at the military academies. But more fundamentally and beyond that, it means bringing more U.S. government agencies to the table where national security is discussed. There are 3 main deficiencies at play. The first is that pandemics and climate change are not the type of threats the U.S. national security architecture is equipped to identify and neutralize. U.S. national security strategy is designed to identify, deter, and/or compel other armed actors to take certain actions or not take certain actions. U.S. national security strategy is designed to change the rational calculations of both friends and foes. But pandemic disease and climate change are in most ways actorless threats. Because of Richard Clarke, former National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism during the first Bush administration, we know Donald Rumsfeld famously quipped in a briefing on bombing of Afghan infrastructure, "There are no good targets in Afghanistan. Let's bomb Iraq." To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, we can't effectively address pandemic disease or climate change because there are no good targets. You can't bomb a drought into submission or invade and occupy smallpox. And because, as we discussed last week, there are myriad small ways climate change threatens security, it's hard to communicate the magnitude of the threat, which is important for convincing policymakers of the issue's importance and the general public to take necessary actions and make sacrifices. The second issue gets back to the big bad wolf versus termites analogies, the lack of a Pearl Harbor or 9/11 moment. Those events immediately galvanized U.S. public opinion and legitimated exceptional society-spanning policy responses. It also reshaped the United States' entire intelligence apparatus and foreign policy approaches, and unlocked previously unthinkable economic resources and presidential power. We just aren't seeing that type of response to climate change. The third is a mismatch between the nature of the threats and the agencies tasked with addressing them. When we think of national security, we rarely include agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Departments of the Interior and Agriculture, who are responsible for managing forest fires on public lands. These organizations are not coordinated with, nor engaged on security discussions as a matter of course. But I'd like you to ask yourself this: in our current moment, if they were, do you think there would have been better coordination of national level policy? And B, would those agencies have been better resourced to begin with? Whole of government language may ring buzzwordy to some, but this does seem like a situation where that approach is truly necessary. Okay, so what would a reimagined idea of national security look like? Well, 6 things could probably help. First, actorless global challenges like climate and health pandemics need to be a clear priority in the design of foreign policy, in the focus of the intelligence community, and in the missions and structure of the military. One large barrier to COVID response has been the failure to clearly identify a strategic goal. What are we trying to do? If we are actually trying to zero out the coronavirus, all other intermediate goals, such as restarting the economy or helping Americans get back to normal, need to be made clearly subservient to defeating the pandemic. This process is going to be even harder with respect to climate change, but suffice it to say, there's currently no real target, no real strategic goal, at least with respect to national U.S. level policy. Second, retraining, new capabilities, and fundamentally altered budget priorities need to be enacted. Large-scale conventional climate wars are pretty unlikely to materialize. Much more likely to materialize will be performing support and stabilization operations for struggling governments abroad, an increase in demand for disaster relief and response, and massively expanded roles patrolling and conducting search and rescue efforts in the Arctic. Third, the focus of technology development and force deployment will need to shift toward these global issues, especially as the global energy transition renders traditional national security activities, like patrolling the waters of oil-producing regions, less important. The Navy's Fifth Fleet effectively has the job of patrolling the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Is that going to still be worth the cost and effort in a world where oil is vastly more plentiful than demand for it? When Naval Station Pearl Harbor was established in 1899, it was not to house the Pacific Fleet, but rather to serve as a coaling station, where the coal-fueled warships of the time could refuel on their way to or from East Asia. Do you think the U.S. military spends much time and energy acquiring and defending coal deposits these days? Fourth, detailed collaboration tools and procedures across government between the security apparatus and the environmental and public health professionals needs to be put in place. Now, there are some real risks to framing climate change and pandemic disease as primarily security issues, but I want to be clear about something. Securitizing these issues is not the same as militarizing them. The important point is to bring more non-militarized agencies like the EPA or NOAA or the Department of the Interior more fully into the discussion. Fifth, the security focus with a limited view of the benefits of international cooperation needs to change in response to challenges that require collective response. Even with the United States' vast military power, it has been largely unsuccessful in unilateral approaches to securing its national interest in response to even conventional threats. It will be fundamentally and totally unworkable as a response to transnational actorless threats. And finally, a focus on flexibility and resilience and forward planning at the center of a new national security apparatus is essential to better managing these inevitable future disasters and coming calamities. The fights against climate change and pandemic disease are not like conventional campaigns. There will be no battle of the midway moment. Mitigating or adapting to slow onset, actorless threats like climate change and pandemic disease requires a reimagining of our national security priorities and architecture.